Welcome back to the Sleepless Historian. Before we embark on our journey into the utterly riveting world of medieval scone-serving etiquette in the Great Hall, take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. You'll want to be informed the next time we dive into topics so mundane that they make watching paint dry seem like a thrill ride. And don't forget to turn on loop so you can bask in the glory of this video on repeat. Because who wouldn't want to hear about the blander-than-plain toast intricacies of how scones were served centuries ago? Nay. Now, let's set the scene. Imagine yourself in a grand medieval great hall, where knights and lords gather not just to discuss battles and conquests, but to engage in that most riveting of pastimes, scone consumption. Yes, you heard me right, scones. The fluffy, crumbly pastries that would one day be the crowning glory of tea time. But in the medieval era, they were merely another opportunity for social faux pas and awkward moments involving sharp utensils and sticky fingers. The etiquette surrounding scones in the Great Hall was not merely a suggestion. It was a veritable code of conduct, more intricate than the family trees of your average feudal lord. Picture this: a table laden with scones, some with fruit, some without, and some quite possibly made from what we can only hope were edible ingredients. The proper way to serve them was a serious matter, involving a hierarchy so complex that it would make a modern-day corporate ladder look like a child's slide. Now, you may be wondering, why would I care about this? Well, dear viewers, because understanding the scone-serving rituals can provide us with a window into the absurdly trivial yet fascinating world of medieval social customs. From the positioning of the serving platters to the precise way one should pass a scone to a lord without causing an international incident, the stakes were high and the drama was palpable. So, grab your favorite snack, might I suggest a scone? And settle in as we unfold the delightful tedium of medieval scone-serving etiquette. Remember, there's no rush. You're about to dive into a history so bland, it's practically a bedtime story. So, breathe deep, relax, and prepare to be thoroughly underwhelmed. As we wander deeper into the dreary labyrinth of medieval scone-serving etiquette, it's imperative we consider the logistics involved in the production and inventory of these delectable, if dubious, baked goods. You see, adequate scone supply was crucial to maintaining the delicate social fabric of the Great Hall. After all, nothing says welcome quite like a stone-cold scone served with a side of palpable tension. First, let us address the inventory procedures, which, let's be honest, could put even the most dedicated accountant to sleep. The medieval kitchen was a hive of activity, yet also a realm of orderliness that would make a modern-day warehouse manager weep tears of joy, or perhaps despair at the excessive bureaucracy. Each lord's household maintained meticulous records regarding their scone supply, often referred to as the scone ledger, a document so thrilling it could double as a sleep aid. Now, these ledgers detailed everything from the quantity of scones baked each day, typically no fewer than 12 dozen, because what's a banquet without an excess of baked goods, to the exact ingredients used, which, let's be real, ranged from the standard flour and water combo to the occasional adventurous addition of dried fruits. Each entry was accompanied by a signature from the head baker, who, if he was lucky, might escape the kitchen without having his fingers scalded by a rogue bread oven. But wait, the excitement doesn't end here. Each lord or lady had their own set of bureaucratic rules governing the acquisition and distribution of scones. Before any scone could see the light of day, or, more importantly, the inside of a noble's mouth, their ingredients had to be sanctioned by the household steward. This charming individual was often more concerned with the cost of flour than the comfort of guests. A single sack of flour could cost the equivalent of 3 sheep. And if you think that's an unreasonably high price to pay for baked goods, welcome to the medieval economy. Hey! Once the flour was procured, it traveled through a convoluted supply chain that could rival the plot of a particularly dull soap opera. The grain would first be transported by a team of weary peasants, who likely would rather have been anywhere else, before it eventually made its way to the mill. There, the grain would undergo a grinding process overseen by millers who had a curious knack for turning a simple task into a bureaucratic nightmare. And now, you see, every sack of flour was tagged and logged, marked with the miller's personal seal, a wax stamp that was probably considered more valuable than gold in those days. If you think about it, it's the medieval equivalent of a corporate logo, except instead of being emblazoned on fancy products, it was stamped on a sack of flour that may or may not have been infested with weevils. And then came the scone production itself. The head baker, a title that sounds far more prestigious than it actually was responsible for ensuring that the scones met the strict quality standards laid out by the lord or lady of the manor. And let me tell you, these standards were stricter than a royal decree against the use of forks at the dinner table. A scone could be deemed inferior if it didn't meet the height requirement of at least 2 inches, or if it lacked the proper golden brown hue. No, Anmal. Siome say, yes, color was a major sticking point. If your scone came out looking like it had just emerged from a particularly unkind sunbathing session, you could expect a stern reprimand from the kitchen staff. Such was the life of our beleaguered head baker, who in the grand hierarchy of the Great Hall was only a few rungs above the scullery maid, yet infinitely more likely to become the target of a noble's wrath. Once the scones were baked, assuming they survived the gauntlet of quality checks, they were then arranged on platters. Ah yes, the platters! An overlooked but crucial component of our scone saga. The arrangement of scones was an art form, dictated by a set of unwritten rules that would make modern-day etiquette books look like elementary school art projects. Scones were to be arranged in a specific order, with those boasting edible fruit placed on the outer edge, while those that were decidedly less appetizing were relegated to the inner circle. This placement wasn't arbitrary. It signified the social rank of the guests. A lord would never dare serve a scone made from moldy flour to a visiting dignitary. No, that would be a scandal of epic proportions, leading to potential diplomatic repercussions that could spiral out of control faster than you could say, baked goods. After the arrangement came the serving, an event that could be likened to a high-stakes game of chess. The server, generally a lowly squire or perhaps a nervous page, had to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval etiquette without causing offense or triggering a feud that could last for generations. The method of passing a scone was a finely tuned craft, requiring the server to hold the scone with 2 fingers delicately, so as not to crush it. An act that would surely invite scorn from any self-respecting lord or lady. Once the scone was in hand, the server had to ensure that the recipient's right hand was extended at the optimal angle. Too low, and the scone would fall. Too high, and it might lead to a misunderstanding that could spark a duel. Yes, you heard it right. A duel over a scone. If you think that sounds absurd, you're absolutely correct. But this was the reality of the Great Hall, where the stakes were higher than the ceilings, and the consequences of a poorly executed scone pass could ripple throughout society like a particularly bad case of the hiccups. You might wonder how one learned the intricate dance of scone service. Alas, there were no online tutorials or etiquette classes. Instead, young squires were subjected to years of rigorous training under the watchful eyes of seasoned servers. Imagine a sort of medieval boot camp, where trainees perfected their grip on scones while trying to avoid the wrath of an irate lord dissatisfied with their service. If they were lucky, they would emerge from this training with both their dignity and their fingers intact. And let's not forget the aftermath of a scone-serving event. Once the scones were distributed, there was the delightful task of managing the leftovers, because heaven forbid any scone should go uneaten. The remnants would be carefully catalogued, with the scone remnants divided into categories such as still edible and definitely questionable. Those that fell into the latter category were often repurposed into a rather unappealing version of bread pudding, which was then served to the kitchen staff as a reward for their hard work. In summary, the labyrinthine world of medieval scone-serving etiquette is a veritable goldmine of trivial yet fascinating tidbits. From the tedious inventory procedures to the high-stakes scone-passing techniques, the drama, and by drama, I mean an exasperatingly slow-paced unfolding of events, surrounding these baked goods is enough to make one appreciate the complexities of modern dining, where we're free to serve scones without fear of starting an all-out feud. Well, in niche. So, next time you nosh on a scone with your afternoon tea, take a moment to reflect on the unsung heroes of the Great Hall. The bakers, the stewards, and yes, even the hapless squires, whose lives revolved around the noble art of scone-serving. Their dedication to this most mundane of culinary pursuits is a testament to the lengths one will go to preserve the sanctity of medieval etiquette. One dry, crumbly scone at a time. Now, let us take a deep plunge into the murky waters of inventory procedures, a topic so thrilling it makes watching paint dry look like an action-packed thriller. Imagine, if you will, the great halls adorned with the finest tapestries, where the air is thick with the aroma of baking bread and the faint cadence of whispered complaints from squires. Overseeing the stock of scones was no small feat. It required meticulous record-keeping that might have made even the most ardent accountant weep with joy. Every morning, the head baker, crowned with flour-dusted hair and a stern expression that suggested an unyielding dedication to gluten, would embark on the grand ritual of inventory. Picture him, a veritable titan of tedium, surrounded by a cadre of equally uninspired apprentices. With quill in hand and parchment spread across a rickety wooden table, he would mark down every single scone produced, categorized by type, flavor, and, get this, potential for future consumption. Yes, that's right. Scones weren't just baked. They were categorized with the same enthusiasm as a medieval tax collector sifting through peasant accounts. He would begin with the plain scones, those unadorned lumps of flour that were as exciting as a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Next came the slightly more intriguing currant scones, which boasted the faintest hint of sweetness if you squinted while chewing. And then, in a fit of wild creativity that could only be described as positively scandalous, he might include the lemon zest scones. The audacity! The baker would tally each scone, ensuring that he had an adequate stock for the day's service, while simultaneously engaging in an elaborate mental debate about whether the lemon zest scones should have been considered a separate category or simply a variant of the plain scone. To the untrained eye, these lists would appear to be nothing more than a collection of numbers and letters, yet in the hands of the baker, they held the key to the Great Hall's culinary fate. If the inventory showed that only 3 lemon zest scones remained, the baker would have to strategize like a military general planning a siege, where to allocate resources, how to bake more before the evening feast, and most importantly, how not to anger the Lord of the Manor, who had a notoriously low tolerance for shortages. Now, let's not forget the costs involved in crafting these delightful, or in some cases decidedly mediocre, baked tea goods. Flour, for example, was a staple, but came with a price tag that could make one reconsider the merits of a basic loaf of bread versus the far more extravagant scone. In a world where coinage was as precious as a knight's honor, the bakers had to keep a keen eye on prices. The grain merchants, much like the modern-day used car salesman, knew the art of haggling. The baker would inevitably find himself bartering with a merchant who had mastered the art of upselling. Ah, but my good sir, for just a few extra pennies, I could provide you with flour harvested during a waxing moon, known for its lightness and airy texture. And if the flour was exorbitantly priced, the baker might be tempted to order a lower quality substitute. This could lead to the grisly fate of serving scones that were as dense as a medieval tome. And heaven forbid if the Lord's guests started to complain. Surely a fate worse than 1,000 sconeless feasts. I see. A wine for. Now, while all of this sounds drearily predictable, one must also consider the bureaucratic rules that governed the entire scone-serving enterprise. The Great Hall had its own unwritten codes of conduct, like a set of medieval social media guidelines, only less engaging and with a lot more flour. The protocols dictated not only how many scones were to be made, but also how they should be served. Ah, yes, serving a scone was an art form, akin to a finely choreographed ballet. The server, who was usually a jittery squire, had to navigate the tables with the finesse of a tightrope walker. The etiquette demanded that the scones be served from the left side. An arbitrary decision, no doubt, but one that had been rigorously established by a centuries-old council of disgruntled lords, who likely had nothing better to do. Imagine the horror of a scone being served from the right. The gasps. The drama. The accusatory glares from the lord's wife, whose own scone-serving experience clearly entitled her to judge the performance of the hapless squire. Heaven forbid if they were ever served upside down. It was a culinary faux pas so egregious that it might lead to whispers of treason among the nobility. And let's not overlook the issue of temperature. Scones had to be served warm. If they were cold, the server might as well have been committing an act of high treason. One could only imagine the whispers in the hall. Did you taste that? A cold scone. Have they no respect for our delicate palates? The poor squire would likely be summoned to the lord's chamber, where he would be subjected to a thorough questioning on his scone-serving techniques, perhaps even facing a stern lecture on proper temperature, maintenance, diet toll. And what of the ceremonial placement of the scones? A well-placed stack of scones could elevate a meal from drudgery to near euphoria. The exact number of scones per plate was another point of contention. 3 was considered polite, but 5 was ostentatious and could lead to accusations of gluttony. The servers would be caught in a moral quandary, to please their lord while adhering to the strict, unwritten laws of scone etiquette. This constant push and pull between abundance and restraint created an environment ripe for scandal. One miscalculation could lead to whispers that would echo through the Great Hall for generations. Did you hear about Sir Reginald? They say he served too many scones at the banquet last summer. Poor fellow, I doubt he'll ever recover from the shame. Finally, we must address the aftermath of the scone-serving ritual, the cleanup. The stewards, those unsung heroes of the Great Hall, were left to deal with the crumbs that littered the floor like the last remnants of a long-forgotten battle. Their task was not merely to clean, but to organize the leftover scones, which were treated with the same reverence as relics. Some were deemed worthy of being recycled into the next day's bread pudding, while others were simply tossed aside, left to be ridiculed by the kitchen staff for being yesterday's news. The kitchen staff would often engage in lively debates over these scones, forming alliances based on their preferences. I heard Harold saved a batch of the lemon zest ones yesterday, and now he's claiming they're gourmet. One cook might whisper, while another would roll their eyes, as if they're just stale scones with delusions of grandeur. The entire process, from inventory to serving, was a veritable dance of decorum, one that may not have changed significantly over the centuries, but certainly allowed for endless opportunities for gossip, rivalry, and dare I say, a touch of absurdity. So, dear viewers, as you sip your Earl Grey and indulge in a scone of your own, remember the labyrinthine legacy of those medieval scone servers. Each crumb of history is as rich and complex as the scone itself. Dry, crumbly, and occasionally, just a tad stale. And in this world of culinary complexities, who knew that the most mundane of topics could hold such profound depths of absurdity? Indeed. Now, as we delve deeper into the world of medieval scone-serving etiquette, let us unearth the truly scintillating details of inventory procedures. Now, I know what you're thinking. Inventory. How riveting. But bear with me, for this is where the true art of scone servitude lies in hiding. Much like a well-baked scone can conceal its lack of flavor behind a facade of buttery goodness. Picture this, the great hall of a medieval castle, its stone walls echoing with the faint sounds of courtly laughter and the clinking of goblets. Amidst this majestic chaos, there exists a dusty nook where the scone inventory is meticulously maintained. Yes, the scone inventory. It was not simply a list of baked goods. It was a sacred ledger, a tome that rivaled the most ambitious medieval manuscripts in its significance. This ledger would be divided into two main sections, the inward and the outward. In the inward section, each batch of scones would be meticulously recorded with the date of arrival, the name of the baker, and, most importantly, the cost of materials. The materials, dear viewers, were a veritable cornucopia of delights, flour, butter, sugar, and if the stars aligned, perhaps even the rare and exotic ingredient known as lemon zest. Such a luxury would usually send the kitchen staff into a tizzy debating whether the price was justified, or if they could stretch the budget by using a less glamorous ingredient, like the ever-reliable cinnamon. Now, when it came to the cost of flour, one must understand that this was not just any flour we are talking about, but rather the finest milled flour that could be procured from the village miller. This was a serious business. Not only did the cost fluctuate with the seasons, but the quality of flour was also subject to the whims of the miller's mood that day. A particularly grumpy miller could yield flour so coarse it could double as medieval sandpaper. One can only imagine the discussions that transpired when a batch of scones made with such flour emerged from the oven. Yes, the texture really adds a certain rustic charm, one may say, all while secretly wondering if they'd have to chew it with a side of dental floss. And let's not forget about the butter. Medieval butter was a complex affair. It was often the subject of fierce debate among the kitchen staff. Was it churned from cow's milk? Goat's milk? Or perhaps it was the prized butter, sourced from that one cow that supposedly grazed on the finest grass in the land? Grass that was, by all accounts, blessed by the local priests. In any event, the butter's expense was carefully noted in the scone ledger. One could often sense the palpable tension in the kitchen as the butter would arrive. I can't believe they charged us that much. It's butter, not gold, the staff would lament, clutching their precious ledger as if it held the key to their very souls. Next came the outward section of the ledger, where each scone served was dutifully documented, often alongside the name of the noble who received it. Picture it, 2 scones to Lord Fitzwilliam, one of which was of questionable freshness, no lemon zest, of course. This section became an essential record, not just for culinary tracking, but for the all-important task of ensuring that the kitchen maintained a good standing with the upper echelons of society. After all, if Lord Fitzwilliam received a stale scone, it might just spark a political scandal of epic proportion. A scone unfit for a lord, off with their heads, could easily become a rallying cry in the antechambers of the castle. But the drama did not end there. Once the inventory was complete, the next step involved a bureaucratic nightmare that would make even the most seasoned office worker weep. Enter the kitchen master, the unsung hero of the Great Hall, who was tasked with the unenviable job of reconciling the inventory with the castle's accounts. This was not simply a task of matching numbers, mind you. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy. Any discrepancies could lead to a scone scandal, and no one wanted to find themselves in a position of having to explain a missing batch of lemon zest scones to the Baron's wife, an encounter that could result in a very cold reception at the next banquet. As the kitchen master shuffled through parchment and ink, the whispers of the kitchen staff would rise to a fever pitch. What do you think will happen if we short one of the loaves? Perhaps we could create a diversion? They might plot, contemplating an elaborate scheme involving a rogue chicken and a misplaced broom. The stakes were high, folks. A single misplaced scone could disrupt the hierarchy of the entire kitchen, causing ripples that would be felt throughout the castle. One particularly convoluted rule that emerged during these inventory reconciliations was the infamous scone count protocol. This protocol mandated that there be a minimum of 3 staff members present during the scone count, lest there be accusations of malfeasance. I swear, Janet, if you slip a few of those raspberry scones into your apron again, I'll tell the Lord. A cook would hiss, fully aware of the catastrophic consequences of scone theft. No. The scone count itself was a tedious affair, akin to counting sheep, but significantly less entertaining. Staff would huddle around the table, each clutching their own piece of parchment like it was the Holy Grail. One for you, one for me, and one for the cat. They would chant, attempting to keep track of the growing pile, all while dodging the inquisitive glances of passing nobles. Each time a rogue crumb fell from a scone, it was as if the heavens themselves mourned the loss. Not to worry, we'll just write it off as the crumb tax, they'd quip, but the laughter never quite reached their eyes. But what truly makes this whole inventory saga amusing is the fact that, despite all the meticulous record-keeping, the actual serving of scones was still very much a hit-or-miss endeavor. The noble guests, after all, could be fickle. One day they might rave about the scones, declaring them the epitome of culinary excellence, while on another day they could declare them too dry or not sufficiently buttery. The kitchen staff, caught in the crossfire of these culinary critiques, faced an eternal existential crisis. Were they artisans of the scone or mere purveyors of mediocrity? As we continue to unravel this tale of medieval scone-serving etiquette, we must also shine a light on the materials that were used for serving these delicate pastries. The serving platters themselves were a subject of much debate and scrutiny. Did the castle possess the fine silverware that spoke of nobility and grandeur, or were they still utilizing the old wooden boards that had seen better days? The latter could be the source of endless gossip. Did you see the way Lady Agatha grimaced when she was served scones on that old thing? The debate over serving materials led to the rise of the Scone-Serving Committee, a group of nobles who were tasked with ensuring that only the finest platters would grace the Great Hall during feasts. This committee often held meetings that could rival the most important legislative assemblies of the time, complete with heated discussions over whether a particular platter was too rustic or not rustic enough. The fate of the scone depended on this committee's decisions, which could lead to a scandalous rift between the kitchen staff and the nobility. And if you think the drama ended there, you'd be sorely mistaken. Picture the scene. The day of the grand banquet arrives, and the kitchen staff, having prepared for weeks, stands ready to unveil the pièce de résistance, the scones. As they emerge from the oven, golden and fluffy, the tension in the kitchen is palpable. The scone-serving committee, adorned in their finery, takes their seats at the long table, and the first round of scones are presented. But wait, a calamity. A scone, having been deemed less than perfect by a particularly discerning noble, is sent back to the kitchen, and chaos erupts. Suddenly, the kitchen is a flurry of activity, with staff scrambling to replace the offending pastry and save their reputation. "Quick, get the lemon zests! We need to impress!" they shout as the clock ticks down to serving time. Such was the life of the medieval scone server, a role filled with peril, bureaucracy, and the ever-present threat of public humiliation. And as you sit back and enjoy your own scone, perhaps with a dollop of clotted cream, take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of it all. The intricate web of etiquette and expectation that govern the seemingly simple act of serving a scone in the grand halls of history guide away. After all, what could be more thrilling than the knowledge that even in the most mundane of tasks, history weaves its rich, crumbly, and often stale narrative? Yeah. As the dust settles from the chaos of the kitchen, we can take a moment to delve into the intricacies of medieval scone-serving procedures. You might think that serving a scone is a straightforward task, but oh, how wrong you would be. In fact, the entire operation was an exercise in meticulous detail, akin to the planning of a military campaign, albeit with fewer horses and more pastries. Let us begin with the inventory procedures, shall we? Each great hall had its own dedicated scone inventory keeper, a position that was as prestigious as it was thankless. This individual was responsible for tracking the stocks of flour, sugar, butter, and those all-important flavorings like currants and caraway seeds. The inventory keeper maintained a detailed ledger, complete with ornate calligraphy and the occasional doodle of a scone that looked suspiciously like a small boulder. Every Monday, the keeper would conduct a full inventory count. The process was laborious, taking hours as they counted each sack of flour, weighed the butter, and measured the sugar with a kind of precision that would make a modern-day baker weep. If a single scone was missing from the storeroom, it would trigger an investigation that could rival the Spanish Inquisition. Not that anyone had ever expected the Spanish Inquisition, of course. Now, what about the costs, you ask? The costs. The economics of scone production were a thrilling roller coaster of fluctuating prices and trade routes. Flour was relatively inexpensive, thanks to the abundance of grain in the medieval countryside. But the cost of butter could vary wildly depending on the season and the whims of local dairy farmers. You see, butter did not just magically appear. It was the result of hours of churning, often performed by a peasant girl with a sore arm and dreams of escaping to the nearest castle. Dreams that often ended in scone-related drudgery. Fill and see. And let's not forget the sugar. Yes, sugar. In medieval times, it was a luxury item, imported from far-off lands like the mysterious East. A single pound of sugar could cost as much as a small cow, which meant that every pinch added to the scone recipe was a serious monetary consideration. The noble class was quite fond of using sugar as a status symbol, so you can imagine the gasps of horror when a scone served in the Great Hall lacked the sweet touch of the coveted ingredient. With costs carefully monitored, the bureaucratic rules surrounding scone production were as intricate as the recipes themselves. Each scone recipe was a closely guarded secret, often passed down through generations of kitchen staff. The head cook would hold meetings, complete with quill pens and parchment, to discuss the upcoming banquet and which variations of scones would grace the table. These meetings could drag on for hours, filled with debates about the optimal ratio of butter to flour, or whether nutmeg is an appropriate flavoring for a scone intended for the king. Spoiler, it almost never was. During these meetings, a hierarchy emerged. The head cook, a figure draped in flowery finery, would preside over the gathering, flanked by sous chefs and the aforementioned scone inventory keeper, who would nervously shuffle papers and occasionally chime in with a suggestion about the benefits of using sourdough as a base. We must remain traditional. The head cook would bellow, eyes blazing, before launching into a passionate oration about the virtues of a perfectly fluffy scone. Once the recipe was finalized, it was time to draft the scone-serving protocol. This 5-page document outlined everything from the angle at which the scone should be presented to the proper response, if a noble were to request a specific flavor. The latter was a particularly tricky situation, as nobles were notoriously fickle, demanding exotic flavors that might not even exist in the kingdom. "What do you mean you don't have rosewater scones?" One noble might thunder, while another would insist on scones infused with the essence of lavender and the tears of distant travelers. To prepare for such eventualities, the kitchen staff would sometimes engage in mock drills, practicing the art of scone, serving as if they were rehearsing for a royal play. Noble patrons would be simulated by kitchen apprentices wearing makeshift crowns, while the servers would practice their curtsies and hand movements, trying not to drop the delicate pastries. One slip could mean the end of a kitchen career and an embarrassing stint as a lowly scullery maid, or even worse, a permanent ban from the Great Hall. On the day of the grand feast, the atmosphere in the kitchen would reach a fever pitch. Staff members scurried about, whispering to each other in hushed tones. "Have you heard? Lord Wimpleton is bringing his new scone knife." This legendary cutlery was said to slice through a scone with such precision that it could make the delicate crumb levitate. An exaggeration, but one that only added to the pressure of the occasion. As the scones were finally baked and cooled, they were placed in a lavishly decorated basket, adorned with flowers and ribbons, because what would a scone be without a touch of decorative flair? The final touch involved a sprig of rosemary or thyme to give the illusion of sophistication, as if the mere presence of herbs could elevate the humble scone to the status of culinary masterpiece. When the moment of truth arrived, servers lined up, each ready to present their scone-laden baskets to the lords and ladies seated at the long wooden table, which had been polished to a shine that could rival a newly minted coin. Each server had to maintain an air of gravitas, balancing the weight of the moment with the knowledge that a single misstep could seal their fate. When the grand hall doors swung open, the servers poured into the room, and the collective gasp of the nobles echoed off the stone walls. "Scones! At last!" cried Lady Beatrice, who had been eagerly awaiting the buttery delights. The process of serving itself was another exercise in protocol. Each noble had a designated order of precedence, which dictated how the scones would be presented. The servers had to be acutely aware of who was seated where, as serving the wrong noble first could result in severe reprimands, or worse, a public display of disdain. Your Grace, may I present the rosemary-infused scones, freshly baked and still warm, the head server would declare, bowing deeply while trying not to drop the basket. "Oh, thank you, good sir," would come the reply, usually accompanied by a dramatic wave of the hand. Pow. All this while, the scone inventory keeper stood in the corner, nervously checking off items on a scroll, hoping against hope that all varieties had been accounted for, and that the noble's palate did not include any unacceptable flavors. As the evening progressed, the scone-serving ritual reached its zenith. Nobles would critique the offerings with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for fine wines or battle strategies. "This one is too dry," Lord Humpington would declare, waving his hand dismissively, while another would proclaim, "But this one reminds me of my childhood." Behind the scenes, the kitchen staff could only hope that their efforts would lead to praise rather than scorn. Each scone was a small piece of their dignity, a testament to their labor and skill, and a reflection of the absurdity of their existence in this medieval world of hierarchy and pastry. So, as you sit there with your own scone, perhaps slightly stale or lacking the finesse of a medieval masterpiece, remember the lives, the dreams, and the endless bureaucracy that went into its creation. For in every bite, there exists a history rich with detail, frivolity, and the ever-looming specter of a noble's judgment. As the evening dwindled into the depths of mediocrity, and the last crumbs of scone were swept into the chins of the noble elite, one could not help but ponder the intricate web of bureaucracy that held the medieval scone-serving system together. A veritable tapestry woven from the threads of tedious inventory procedures, meticulous material costs, and the kind of red tape that could make a commoner's head spin faster than a rogue scone on a banquet table. First, we must delve into the labyrinthine inventory procedures that ruled the kitchens in castles far and wide. The head cook, a position that was as perilous as it was prestigious, was often found hunched over a scroll, quill in hand, marking down every last ingredient with the precision of an accountant on the eve of tax season. Flour, sugar, butter, and the ever-elusive clotted cream were all accounted for, each measured in ounces and drams, with a keen eye on the dwindling stocks. Imagine the scene. The head cook, known affectionately as Chef Bumblington, mostly because he was perpetually covered in flour, was tasked with ensuring that each noble's appetite was satisfied, and that they were blissfully unaware of the chaos that often lurked behind the kitchen doors. He would glance nervously at the ledger, performing mental gymnastics to ascertain whether or not he had enough flour to last until the next shipment from the local mill. If he found himself running low, it was only a matter of time before the castle steward would come knocking, armed with a relentless checklist of grievances and an insatiable need for accountability that rivaled even the most fastidious tax collector. But where did they source this flour, you ask? The flour! A tale as dull as the flour itself. Most of it came from local mills operated by millers who, in an ironic twist of fate, were usually in a perpetual battle with the lord of the manor. You see, millers were notorious for their creative interpretations of weight. Flour would be delivered in sacks that may or may not contain the promised amount, and the cook had to weigh each sack with the kind of skepticism normally reserved for checking a noble's gold coins for authenticity. If a sack was light, it was said to be cursed by the spirits of the unbaked, a phrase that was conveniently used to avoid blame when the scones turned out to be flatter than the lord's sense of humor. Then there were the butter procurement procedures, which were equally riveting. Butter, that glorious golden delight that made scones sing with buttery joy, came from the dairy maids who churned it by hand. Yes, that's right, by hand. Imagine a group of peasant women sitting in a dank corner of the castle, churning away, while engaging in what must have been the most enthralling conversations about the latest gossip, which typically revolved around the size of the lord's waistline or the number of rats seen scuttling through the great hall. One could say that butter procurement was almost a competitive sport. The best butter was often fiercely contested, and the dairy maid who produced the creamiest, most spreadable butter gained not only prestige, but the undying admiration of the head cook. If the scone was a noble, then the butter was its loyal steed, essential for a successful encounter at the banquet table. However, the unfortunate truth was that butter was rarely consistent. Sometimes it would be delightfully whipped and smooth. Other times, it would resemble a lumpy mess that could only be described as an affront to gods and nobles alike. And let's not forget about the sugar. Oh, sweet sugar, that precious commodity that was more valuable than gold in the medieval world. Sugar came with a price, one that could lead even the most level-headed steward to madness. It was typically imported, having journeyed from exotic lands, perhaps brought back by sailors who had braved storms and sea monsters, only to find themselves in a castle kitchen haggling over the cost. A mere sack could cost the equivalent of a year's wages for a commoner, and thus the kitchen staff resorted to all sorts of clever subterfuges to stretch their supplies. A pinch of honey or a dash of molasses was often added in a desperate attempt to mask the fact that they were running dangerously low. Now, in the castle kitchen, the decorum surrounding the scone was not just about flavor. It was also about presentation. Each scone had to be uniform in size, an unyielding requirement that would make any modern baker cringe. The head cook had a beloved scone mold, a wooden contraption that could churn out perfectly shaped rounds, but only if the dough was just the right consistency. Too wet, the dough would stick, and our hapless cook would be left scraping goo off the mold, while the nobles prepared to unleash their wrath. Too dry, you'd have scones that resembled rock-hard frisbees, perfect for hurling at the heads of pesky court jesters, but utterly unpalatable for the noble palate. Once the scones were baked and had cooled ever so slightly, they had to be arranged on platters with the kind of artistry deserving of a Renaissance painting. The platters were often gilded, if the budget allowed, and were sometimes adorned with flowers that had been plucked from the castle gardens, if the gardener was feeling particularly generous. This was not merely an exercise in aesthetics. It was a way of signaling to the assembled nobility that, see, we are cultured and exquisite. The flowers, however, had to be selected carefully, as an unintentional choice of a particularly pungent herb could lead to accusations of scone sabotage, a term that could ruin a cook's career faster than a poorly seasoned stew. But the drama didn't end with the scone itself. The serving procedure also required strict adherence to a set of unwritten rules that would baffle even the most seasoned etiquette expert. The head servant, a position akin to a battlefield general, had to orchestrate the entire operation with a level of finesse that left little room for error. One wrong move, like serving Lord Humpington's scone before Lady Butterworth's, could result in a scandal that echoed through the corridors for years. Each noble had specific preferences that were logged in the kitchen ledger, a holy grail of sorts for the kitchen staff. Lord Humpington, for example, preferred his scones with a hint of rosemary, while Lady Butterworth would only accept hers with a delicate dusting of powdered sugar, lest she declare it fit for a peasant. In the high-stakes game of scone serving, one could almost hear the whispers of servants at the periphery, relaying the preferences as if they were the secrets of the universe, while trying not to spill the tea about the latest court intrigues. As the great hall echoed with laughter and critique, the unfortunate reality was that the kitchen staff were often the unsung heroes of these events. They toiled away in obscurity, mixing and measuring, all while the nobles held court, their palates as refined as their egos were inflated. The kitchen was a realm of contradictions, where creativity was stifled by the weight of expectation, and where a single poorly baked scone could lead to a cascade of indignation that would echo through the castle halls for decades. So, as we take a moment to reflect on the intricacies of medieval scone-serving etiquette, we must remember the silent army behind the scone. The cooks, the dairy maids, the millers, and even the head servant, who navigated the treacherous waters of noble demands and expectations. For in their world, every scone was a battle, every serving a potential catastrophe, and every critique a reminder of the ever-watchful eye of the aristocracy. Let us raise our teacups to the scone, an unassuming pastry that not only fed the hungry, but also fed the absurdity of a hierarchical society that placed so much weight on the humble act of serving a baked good. In every crumb there exists a story. In every bite, a lesson in the ridiculousness of our shared history and the lengths we go to for pastries. Monsieur and why? As we delve deeper into the scone-serving saga, we find ourselves faced with a labyrinth of inventory procedures that would make even the most seasoned accountant's head spin. Picture this: an expansive cellar filled to the brim with sacks of flour, barrels of cream and crates of currants, all awaiting the meticulous scrutiny of the castle's master of supplies. This individual, a title that sounds far more glamorous than it actually is, was often a grizzled veteran of the kitchen, overseeing a stockpile that had more layers than a medieval onion. The inventory process itself was a feat of bureaucratic gymnastics. Every item had to be accounted for, documented in a ledger that would make a modern-day spreadsheet look like a doodle on a napkin. Flour, for instance, was measured in bushels, a unit of measurement that, to this day, remains a mystery to most, and had to be recorded with precision down to the last grain. Should the master of supplies miscalculate even a handful, it could result in an egregious shortage of scones, leading to a ripple effect of discontent that would engulf the entire household. And don't even get me started on the costs. The price of a sack of flour in the 14th century was not merely a matter of simple arithmetic. It fluctuated like the moods of a tempestuous lord. Seasonal changes, crop failures, and even the occasional riot could drastically alter prices, leading to frantic meetings among the kitchen staff, where the head chef would dramatically wave his arms as he lamented the rising costs of butter, a veritable tragedy on par with the Black Death in the eyes of the nobility. Materials, too, were the subject of endless debate. The finest flour was often sourced from distant lands, arriving at the castle on the backs of weary horses. This was not just any flour. It was flour that had been finely sifted, milled, and blessed by the local bishop for good measure. The peasants, in contrast, were left with whatever coarse meal they could scrape together, which was often laced with bits of straw and the occasional rodent. Then we have the butter, an essential component of the medieval scone. The head servant would supervise the dairymaids, who were tasked with churning the milk into the creamy goodness that would later grace the noble's table. The process of butter making was an art form in itself, requiring not just skill, but also a certain flair for the dramatic. Should the butter not reach the proper consistency, too soft and it would slide off the scone like a disgruntled servant. Too hard, and it would be akin to trying to spread a brick on your breakfast. The repercussions could be disastrous. Apparently, a nobleman once declared a butter mishap as akin to treason, leading to a series of unfortunate events that included a banishment to the far reaches of the estate for the poor dairymaid. No. And while we're speaking of treasonous acts, let's not overlook the scandalous world of scone flavorings. Currants, raisins, and even the occasional exotic spice were highly sought after, and debates over the proper accoutrements could forge lifelong feuds. The inclusion of too many currants could lead to accusations of overindulgence, while a scone devoid of fruit might incite whispers of insulting frugality. The delicate balance between frugality and extravagance was a minefield no cook dared to tread lightly upon. But even the most carefully crafted scone could be rendered completely irrelevant in the face of the Great Hall's draconian serving rules. As the head chef assembled his team, they would huddle together, eyes darting nervously, as they reviewed the stringent guidelines laid out by the lord of the castle. The first rule was the 5-minute rule. Once the scones emerged from the oven, they had precisely 5 minutes before they were deemed stale by the noble palate. A minute more than that, and the scones were banished to the servants' quarters, where they could only hope to be repurposed as a somewhat palatable bread pudding. The second rule, perhaps the most absurd of all, was the infamous 3-scone maximum. The nobles had decreed that no guest could be served more than 3 scones at a time. This seemingly arbitrary number stemmed from a long-standing belief that excessive scone consumption could lead to social chaos. Can you imagine a raucous dinner party spiraling into anarchy over a 4th scone? Next came the manner of presentation, a topic so fraught with implications that it could spark debates lasting longer than a particularly dull sermon. Scones were to be served on platters made of the finest pewter, arranged in a symmetrical triangle, with the top scone facing the Lord's favored direction, lest ye provoke the ire of a particularly petulant noble. Any deviation from this sacred geometry could lead to a cascade of accusations of incompetence, resulting in a scone-serving scandal that would haunt the kitchen staff for generations. As the scones were finally presented to the lords and ladies, the kitchen staff could only watch with bated breath. Would the noble take a bite? Would there be a sigh of satisfaction or a grimace of disdain? A single moment could determine their fates. If the scones were well received, it could lead to a brief but glorious period of praise. Until the next meal, of course, when the cycle of anxiety would begin anew. Now, speaking of cycles, let's not forget the weekly scone review, a phenomenon that was both the bane and the highlight of the kitchen staff's existence. This review was a formal gathering of the nobles, during which they would sample the week's scone offerings and provide feedback. This was no casual affair. It was an event replete with pomp and circumstance, where the head chef would present his creations with the gravitas of a head of state unveiling a new policy. The tension in the room was palpable, as the noble women delicately nibbled on their scones, while sharing whispered critiques that could either elevate or ruin the chef's career in a matter of minutes. "Oh, delightful texture," one would exclaim, while another might follow up with, "But the aftertaste is reminiscent of last week's pottage." The chef would nod solemnly, scribbling notes furiously. It was all very dramatic, as if the future of the realm depended on the outcome of this pastry presentation. And through all of this, the true unsung heroes remained in the shadows. The servants who toiled away in the kitchen, often going unnoticed until something went wrong. It was they who knew the secret to the perfect scone lay not just in the ingredients, but in the right pinch of chaos and a heaping spoonful of anxiety. They were the ones who understood that the real magic of the scone was not in the baking, but in the endless, exhausting dance of societal expectations, where each pastry was a reflection of the precarious balance of power and privilege that defined medieval society. So next time you find yourself enjoying a scone, not just any scone, mind you, but one baked with love, care, and perhaps just a hint of existential dread, think of the medieval kitchens and the lives entwined in the absurd dance of etiquette and hierarchy. Remember the hundreds of hours spent navigating the labyrinth of inventory, costs, and the ever-watchful gaze of the nobility. In every bite, you're not just tasting a flaky pastry. You're sampling a slice of history steeped in a bizarre cocktail of social stratification, culinary brilliance, and a hefty dose of ridiculousness that stretches across the centuries. Cheers to that! Whoa. As we meander deeper into the labyrinthine world of medieval scone-serving etiquette, let us not forget the intricate inventory procedures that underpin this culinary conundrum. Inventory, dear viewers, was not merely a list of flour and sugar. Oh no. It was an epic saga of procurement, tracking, and endless bureaucratic paperwork, if one could even call it that in an age where parchment was precious and ink was sometimes just a fancy way to make a quill feel important. Imagine a medieval kitchen where the head cook, known as the master of the kitchen, a title that sounds far grander than the actual job of walking around with a ladle, sat down with a ledger that likely weighed as much as a small child. This ledger wasn't merely for jotting down how many eggs were delivered from the local henhouse. No, it was a meticulous account of every single ingredient coming in and out of the kitchen. One wrong entry could lead to a royal scandal, and we all know how sensitive nobles can be about their breakfast pastries. To keep everything in check, the master of the kitchen relied heavily on a team of underlings, because what's a power structure without a few minions to do the dirty work? These poor souls, often referred to as poulterers or baker's boys, had the delightful task of counting and cataloging every last grain of flour and ounce of butter. They would spend hours in the storerooms, squinting at fading scrolls and struggling to decipher the scrawled handwriting of their predecessors, an exercise in patience rivaling that of a medieval monk trying to copy the Bible by candlelight. Aye. But inventory was merely the beginning. Next came the ever-thrilling world of material costs. The pricing of ingredients in the medieval market was a dizzying affair, fluctuating more than a peasant's mood after a hard day's labor. One day, sugar might be a reasonable 5 pence per pound, a veritable bargain for a sweetener in an age where honey was the primary alternative. And the next, due to a particularly inconvenient invasion or a failed crop, it could skyrocket to a staggering 10 pence. The cost of butter, too, was as fickle as a courtier's loyalty, rising and falling based on the whims of the weather and the satisfaction of the local cows. Yeah, as if that weren't enough to make the master of the kitchen's head spin, there were bureaucratic rules galore that dictated how one should procure these ingredients. Every noble household had its own unique set of regulations, often handed down from generation to generation, as if they were sacred texts carved in stone. Some households insisted on sourcing only from local farms, while others preferred the exotic delights of spices freshly arrived from the farthest reaches of the known world. Because what's a good scone without a sprinkling of cinnamon from the east? The competition for the finest ingredients often led to more than mere back and forth at local markets. We're talking about full-blown political intrigue, complete with spies disguised as merchants and the occasional assassination attempt over a particularly coveted batch of saffron. But let us not forget the glorious art of budgeting. Every noble household had a carefully crafted budget for kitchen expenditures, which was, unsurprisingly, a source of endless contention. The head cook would sit down with the steward, a position that, despite its lofty title, often involved counting beans and arguing over the price of turnips. It was a match made in bureaucratic hell, where the steward would insist that the kitchen could survive on day-old bread and the occasional apple, while the head cook was convinced that only the freshest ingredients could possibly satisfy the palate of that Earl of somewhere. As a result, there were often elaborate negotiations over what was deemed an acceptable expenditure. The head cook would present a list of necessary ingredients, carefully calculated to ensure that each scone was perfect in both taste and presentation, and then the steward would respond with a counteroffer that was about as appealing as a bowl of stale porridge. "How about we skip the butter this week and just use lard instead?" the steward might propose, while the cook's eyes widened in horror, imagining the culinary abomination that would surely ensue. In the midst of this financial dance, the master of the kitchen had to maintain a delicate balance. Each scone was not just an item on a menu. It was a declaration of loyalty, a testament to the kitchen's ability to impress, and most importantly, a means of navigating the treacherous social waters of medieval court life. This isn't just a matter of flour and water, folks. This is a battlefield where the stakes are nothing less than honor and reputation, where a slightly overbaked scone could lead to a week of cold shoulders from the lady of the house. But wait, there's more. The serving of scones was an event unto itself, a carefully choreographed performance that would make a royal banquet look like a casual picnic. The scones had to be presented, not just served. There were rules about how many scones could be placed on a platter, the angle at which they were to be arranged, and of course, the all-important question of whether to serve them warm or at room temperature. Spoiler alert, serving them cold. Absolute heresy. Once the scones were ready, they would be whisked away to the great hall, where the atmosphere was a veritable minefield of potential faux pas. The servants, often referred to as scullions, which sounds far more dignified than it is, would line up to present the scones to the lord and lady of the house. Each scullion was trained in the ancient art of the graceful bow, a skill honed through hours of practice, as well as the occasional reprimand for dropping a scone on the floor, a fate worse than death in the eyes of any kitchen staff. As the scones made their debut, one could practically hear the gasps of admiration echoing throughout the hall. "Look at those perfectly golden scones," one noblewoman might exclaim, feigning interest while secretly plotting her next move in the ongoing battle for culinary supremacy. But meanwhile, the lord of the house would lean forward, inspecting each scone with the scrutiny of a man judging a horse race. "Is this a hint of nutmeg I taste?" he might demand, sending the head cook into a spiral of panic. Yeah. The act of eating the scone itself was a studied affair, fraught with potential pitfalls. One could not simply pick up a scone and bite into it. That would be far too pedestrian. Instead, the elegant noblewoman would delicately break off a piece, ensuring that it crumbled just so, before applying a dollop of clotted cream, ideally harvested from the dairy of the finest cow in the kingdom. The manner in which one spread the cream was as much a matter of technique as it was of artistry. Too much cream, a sign of gluttony. Too little, a sign of frugality that could arouse suspicion about one's social standing. Not tough. And let us not forget the all-important beverage that accompanied the scone, tea. Yes, the mere act of sipping tea while eating a scone was a whole other level of etiquette that could lead to scandal if not performed correctly. One could not simply gulp down the tea. It had to be sipped daintily, with the pinky finger extended as if one were a bird about to take flight. The wrong angle, the wrong pace, and one could find themselves the subject of gossip for weeks, perhaps even banished from the great hall in disgrace. So here we are, dear viewers, in a world where a simple pastry served in a medieval great hall held the power to shape reputations, forge alliances, and even topple nobility. Every detail, each ingredient, each serving method, each whispered word, echoed the complexities of a society that thrived on the absurdity of its own rules. The next time you savor a scone, take a moment to appreciate the historical absurdity of it all. It's not just a snack. It's a portal to a world filled with dizzying details, chronicled in the annals of culinary history, where the stakes were as high as the flour bins were deep. Now, let's take a moment to delve even deeper into the minutiae of medieval scone-serving etiquette. After all, what is a historical deep dive without a glorious plunge into the abyss of tedious detail? Imagine, if you will, the bustling kitchens of a medieval castle, where the air is thick with the scent of fresh-baked scones and the palpable tension of bureaucratic procedures. For our scone enthusiast, the heart of the matter lies in the procurement and preparation processes that were as convoluted as they were essential. First and foremost, we must discuss the inventory procedures. Inventory! A word that sends shivers down the spine of even the bravest medieval kitchen staff. It was not merely a matter of counting flour sacks and sugar barrels. It was an exercise in precision that would make a modern accountant weep tears of joy, or perhaps tears of despair, depending on how many hundredweight of butter went missing that week. A noble's kitchen boasted an inventory ledger that would rival the length of a medieval epic, with entries recorded in meticulous detail. 5 pounds of currants, 3 pounds of butter, and 2 dozen eggs, all from the finest local suppliers. Each item was not just a number. It was a reflection of the lord's wealth and status, and woe betide the kitchen clerk who miscounted. The procurement process for these ingredients was equally thrilling. A veritable race against time to secure the freshest, most scandal-free supplies. It involved a series of negotiations with local farmers, merchants, and If you were particularly unlucky, the occasional rogue trader who thought he could pass off a sack of moldy flour as vintage. In the cutthroat world of medieval cooking, one had to be ever vigilant. You didn't just want any flour. You wanted the finest milled wheat, preferably ground by a miller with a reputation for honesty. Check the miller's certificates. Yes, they had those, albeit in a decidedly less bureaucratic format than we know today, because a poorly chosen sack of flour could lead to scones that were more rock-like than delicious and, heaven forbid, lead to an embarrassing episode in the Great Hall. Once the ingredients were secured, it was time to prepare for the grand scone ceremony. Here's where the real magic, or perhaps the real madness, occurred. Picture the head cook, clad in a flour-dusted apron, barking orders at a troop of kitchen assistants who were either dutifully kneading dough or engaged in a fierce debate over whether the scones should be studded with currants or raisins. Historical accounts suggest that this debate was so heated that it led to several kitchen mutinies. Yes, indeed. Whole factions formed, declaring in impassioned tones that currants are for the unrefined, and raisins belong only in the hands of commoners. The very moral fabric of the kitchen was at stake, and the fate of the upcoming feast hinged on these culinary politics. And let's not forget the bureaucratic rules governing the actual baking process. The medieval kitchen was a highly stratified environment, with a hierarchy that could rival that of the nobility itself. The head cook had the final say over any decision, but each assistant was given their own set of responsibilities that had to be strictly adhered to. One assistant might be tasked with mixing the dry ingredients, while another was assigned the prestigious role of egg cracker. It was a coveted position, to be sure, but only if you had the skill to crack an egg without getting shell fragments into thick batter, a skill that was actually taught in formal apprenticeships, much to the envy of those less fortunate in their cracking prowess. Once the scone dough was mixed, the next step was shaping them into their intended form. There were strict regulations on size and shape. After all, a misshapen scone could lead to societal chaos. Historical records show that some scone enthusiasts preferred round scones, while others espoused the merits of square ones, believing that squares were more efficient at space management on the serving plates. The debate raged on, with pamphlets circulated throughout the realm, making the case for both shapes, leading to what can only be described as the scone wars of the late 14th century. Entire towns were divided, and friendships were irreparably damaged over a pastry. Talk about a recipe for disaster. Now, let's break down the costs associated with this whole endeavor. You might think, how much could flour and butter possibly cost? Ah, my dear viewers, this is where the rabbit hole goes really deep. A noble's kitchen had to mind the bottom line, lest the lord of the castle find himself in debt to a local merchant, or worse, forced to serve the commoners in the great hall. The cost of flour fluctuated wildly depending on the season, trade routes, and those pesky rumors of crop failures. Yes, the rumors. If a grain merchant caught wind of a bad harvest in a neighboring village, he would raise prices faster than you could say. Baked goods, leaving the head cook scrambling for less reputable sources, perhaps even resorting to sourcing from the questionable vendors in the town market. And let's talk about the logistics of serving these scones. Once baked to perfection, or as close as one could get in a medieval kitchen, the next challenge was the transportation of the scones to the great hall. The serving trays had to be balanced just so, and the servers, often young squires looking to impress the lord, had to navigate a veritable obstacle course of nobility, gossip, and the occasional drunken night. One slip, one fumble, and it was not just the scones that would end up on the floor, but reputations could topple like a house of cards, leading to a scandal that would echo through the ages. While making their way to the great hall, the servers had to adhere to strict paths to avoid the danger zones where lords and ladies congregated to gossip and scheme. An errant tray of scones could easily become the centerpiece of a scandalous tale, with tongues wagging about how Lady Margaret spilled tea all over the Duke of Warwick after a wayward scone accidentally ricocheted off the side of a table. Oh, the horror. It was a perilous journey indeed. Once the scones arrived at the table, the real show began. Servers had to be well-versed in the art of presentation. The arrangement of the scones was more than just a culinary decision. It was a calculated statement of social hierarchy. The tallest scone stack, carefully placed at the center of the table, was reserved for the highest-ranking guests, while the smaller stacks were relegated to lesser nobles, lest anyone forget their place. It was a delicate ballet of baked goods and social standing, one that required years of training, not to mention a firm grasp on the intricacies of who was who in the aristocratic pecking order. As guests began to partake in this grand scone ceremony, the etiquette of consumption was just as crucial. Scones had to be torn apart delicately, never cut with a knife, lest one want to be perceived as brutish, or even worse, ill-mannered. A tattered scone could lead to whispered accusations of barbarism. The spreading of clotted cream was an art form in itself. Too much, and one risked looking greedy. Too little, and one appeared cheap. The balance was so delicate that it required a steady hand and an equally steady heart. And so, the cycle continued, a dizzying whirl of flour, butter, and social maneuvering, all centered around the seemingly innocent act of serving scones in the Great Hall. It was a world where every crumb mattered, where every gesture was scrutinized, and where the stakes were as high as the castle walls. Next time you nibble on a scone, remember that what you are eating is not just a pastry. It's a historical artifact steeped in layers of bureaucracy, etiquette, and an absurd number of rules that would make even the most seasoned modern bureaucrat raise an eyebrow in disbelief. And with that, we leave you to ponder the depths of medieval absurdity, one scone at a time. As we delve deeper into the complexities of medieval scone-serving etiquette in the Great Hall, it becomes painfully clear that the scone was not merely a culinary delight, but an item of significant bureaucratic interest. The inventory procedures alone could make even the most riveting episode of tax law sound like an edge-of-your-seat thriller. Ooh. Picture this: the lord of the castle, a man whose primary duties included ruling over his vassals and ensuring the moats were both damp and intimidating, also had to oversee scone inventory. Yes, scone inventory. Every batch of scones baked in the castle was meticulously recorded. The head baker, or master of scone affairs, was responsible for maintaining a logbook, an ancient tome filled with the weight of flour used, the quantity of butter rendered, and lest we forget, the exact measurements of sugar, which, as we know, fluctuated with the whims of the local sugar merchant. These logs were not just for show. They served as critical documentation in the event of accusations of scone mismanagement. Imagine being summoned to the Lord's Great Hall, standing before the noble court, and having to defend your honor against charges of scone skimping. The shame! It was essential for every baker to keep a keen eye on the distribution of ingredients, lest they face the wrath of the Lord's accountant, an individual whose enthusiasm for ledger entries rivaled that of a tax collector on the 1st of April. Now, let's talk about material costs. Flour, the backbone of scone creation, was not merely a staple, it was a commodity. Prices fluctuated dramatically based on the harvest. If a poor yield came in from the fields, the price of flour could skyrocket, sending shockwaves through the local economy. The noble lords and ladies would sit in their great halls, worrying not only about the quality of their scones, but also about the rising costs that could lead to an insurrection. Or worse, a scandalous scone shortage. Butter was equally important, and just as expensive. The butter used in scones had to be churned to perfection, a process that could take hours. It was not merely about taste. It was a matter of societal status. A poorly churned butter could lead to whispers of butter barbarism among the elite. The more accessible the butter, the more likely it would be laughed at in the courtly gossip mill. Lords and ladies alike would trade tales of butter quality over overly sweetened mead, debating the merits of cow versus goat butter, with the fervor of modern-day sports fans discussing their favorite teams. And then we have the sugar. Ah, yes, sugar. That precious granulated gold that could make or break a scone. It was often imported from lands far away, with merchants transporting it across perilous sea routes. A shipment could be delayed by a storm, resulting in the Great Hall being filled with the scent of unadorned scones, an unforgivable faux pas that could lead to social ostracism. The mere thought of serving a scone without the requisite sprinkle of sugar was enough to send ripples of anxiety through the castle. Thankfully, the castle steward was on hand to allocate the sugar supplies, often through a process that resembled triage more than simple resource management. Let's not forget the utensils. In a world where appearances were everything, the presentation of the scone was paramount. Platters made from gleaming pewter or intricately carved wood were essential. The Great Hall was a stage, and the scone was the leading actor. Utensils were carefully chosen to match the occasion, with silver forks reserved for the most opulent feasts, while wooden spoons were relegated to more humble gatherings. Serving a scone with the wrong utensil could create a social faux pas that would echo through the annals of history, leading to the kind of ridicule that lasts for generations, or at least until the next grand feast. The bureaucratic rules governing the serving process were as labyrinthine as any medieval castle itself. The seating arrangements had to be precise, with the highest-ranking guest seated closest to the lord. This meant that a scone served to a peasant in the farthest corner of the hall could be seen as an insult, a slap in the face of social hierarchy. A misstep in this arrangement could result in a cascade of social consequences, leading to feuds that could last for decades. Serving the scone itself was another matter entirely. There was a strict protocol to follow. The head server, often an unfortunate knight with little else to do, would approach the lords and ladies with the grace of a swan, balancing a platter of scones while navigating the treacherous waters of courtly politeness. The server had to bow at a precise angle, too shallow, and the scone could be seen as an afterthought, too deep, and one risked losing their dignity. The art of scone presentation was indeed a delicate dance, one that could leave a knight paralyzed with fear as he approached the high table. Whoa. Wow. Once at the lord's side, the server would present the scone with a flourish, often accompanied by a brief speech extolling its virtues. "My lord, I present to you the finest scone, baked with the essence of spring and a hint of clotted cream, gathered from the finest cows in the duchy," to which the lord might respond with a curt nod or a grandiose wave, depending on his mood and the quality of the scone. The etiquette surrounding the consumption of the scone was equally elaborate. Guests were expected to nibble delicately, taking small bites and avoiding any unsightly crumbs. The act of tearing a scone was an art form, and one wrong tear could result in a cascade of crumbs that would send a ripple of horror through the hall. Guests often practiced their scone-eating techniques in front of mirrors before grand feasts, ensuring they perfected the delicate balance of grace and gluttony. In the corner of the great hall, a small cadre of kitchen staff watched with bated breath, hoping to catch the eye of their lord and earn a scrap of praise or, even better, a rare morsel of leftover scone. They too were bound by the rules of etiquette, often relegated to the shadows, peering from behind the tapestry, waiting for the moment when they could claim their prize without attracting the ire of the Lord's herald. The aftermath of the scone-serving event was equally fraught with tension. The cleaning and disposal of leftover scones were as serious a matter as their serving. A scone left uneaten could lead to accusations of wastefulness, and the steward would have to account for every crumb. Thus, the remnants were often scavenged by the lower-ranking servants, but only after a careful examination by the head server to ensure that they were still fit for consumption. After all, one could not risk serving yesterday's scones during today's feast. As the evening wound down, and the last remnants of the scone were cleared from the table, the great hall would echo with the chatter of gossip and the clinking of goblets. The lords and ladies would reflect on the high drama of the evening, from the elegant serving of the scones to the delicate dance of etiquette. And while the scone itself might fade from memory, the intricacies of its serving would linger, a testament to the absurdity of medieval life where the stakes were high, and the scones even higher. So, next time you find yourself enjoying a scone in the modern world, take a moment to appreciate the culinary history behind it. The bureaucracy, the etiquette, and yes, even the crumbs that once carried the weight of an entire social structure. For in those moments, you are not just indulging in a treat, you are partaking in a slice of history, where every bite is a reminder that even the most mundane topics can hold layers of intrigue and absurdity just waiting to be uncovered. As the echoes of the great hall faded into the night, one might imagine that the excitement surrounding medieval scones was over, but oh, how wrong that assumption would be. For beneath the surface of this seemingly innocuous delicacy lay an intricate web of bureaucratic procedures, inventory management, and the ever-so-fascinating world of material costs that would cause even the most dedicated historian to yawn uncontrollably. First, let us delve into the world of inventory procedures. You see, serving scones in the Great Hall wasn't as simple as just tossing them on a plate and calling it a day. Oh no, that would be far too easy and far too anarchic for the medieval mind. Instead, a meticulous inventory system was put into place, complete with ledgers that would make any accountant weep with joy. Or perhaps it was despair, given the sheer tedium of it all. Every single scone had to be accounted for. From the moment the flour was milled to the moment it graced the table, puffed and golden under the watchful eyes of the nobility. This meant that there were scribes diligently recording the weight of every sack of flour, the quantity of butter, and even the number of eggs used in the production process. The lord of the manor would insist, rather vehemently I might add, on knowing exactly how many scones were available, how many had been consumed, and most importantly, how many were left to ensure that no peasant might ever sneak a morsel unaccounted for. Inventories were often conducted on a weekly basis, which meant that the kitchen staff would have to summon the energy to count scones after a long, grueling week of mixing, baking, and let's not forget, quite a bit of gossiping. A particularly ambitious cook might even attempt to create a scone with a unique twist, perhaps a dash of rosemary or an infusion of elderflower. But these bold experiments posed a serious risk to the strict inventory measures. If the kitchen produced too many of one kind, it could throw the entire system off balance. The risk of overproduction was a fate worse than a stale scone. And if you think that's tedious, let's not forget about the material costs involved in this scone-serving extravaganza. The Great Hall wasn't just a space for feasting. It was a battleground of finances. The lord's purse had to stretch to accommodate the cost of ingredients, which fluctuated like the mood of a jester on a bad day. One week, the price of flour could be as stable as a well-baked scone, and the next, a sudden grain shortage could send prices skyrocket. Imagine being a medieval lord, staring out the window of your castle, contemplating the implications of a bad harvest on your precious scone supply, while your lady wife demands the finest pastries for her guests. Ah, the tension. The financial strain was so palpable that some lords famously became known for their scone-related frugality. Legend has it that one particularly notorious lord once served scones made with a flour blend that was 90% sawdust. His guests, bewildered by the gritty texture, could hardly believe their taste buds. But let's not forget the costs associated with the butter. The butter. This creamy delight wasn't just a spread, it was a symbol of status. The procurement of butter was a serious matter. Only the freshest cream, churned by the hands of the finest maidens, could suffice for a noble banquet. And if you think you could just waltz into the market and buy a few pounds without a second thought, think again. Butter had its own supply chain, complete with dairymaids who were notorious for their bartering skills. One could only imagine the negotiations that took place as the butter was weighed and measured, with maidens armed with their own scales to ensure fairness. A rogue trader could easily pull a fast one, making medieval life just a tad more interesting, or infuriating, depending on your perspective. The cost of butter was often debated in hushed tones around the Great Hall, with the Lord Steward defending the price against the ladies' insistence that they needed only the finest for their scones. Then there was the matter of presentation. The presentation. Serving scones wasn't merely about placing them on a table. It was about the art of display, which required yet another layer of bureaucratic oversight. The royal table was adorned with platters crafted from the finest pewter, polished to a sheen that reflected the flickering torchlight. These platters were not just any ordinary dishes. They were symbols of wealth and power. Serving scones in a tarnished pewter dish was akin to wearing last year's fashions. Therefore, the stewards had to keep a thorough inventory of the serving ware, conducting inspections that would make a modern-day health inspector cringe. They would meticulously check for any signs of wear or tarnish. And if a platter dared to show its age, it was promptly removed and relegated to the less important feasts, perhaps for the lower-ranking knights or the occasional peasant gathering. Nay. And let's not forget about the napkin situation. Napkin etiquette in the Great Hall was just as elaborate as the scone serving itself. Each guest was assigned a specific color-coded napkin. Yes, that's right, color-coded. To indicate their rank in the social hierarchy. A red napkin for the lord, a blue for the lady, and a drab beige for the peasants. Heaven forbid a peasant accidentally grab a noble's napkin. That would be a faux pas of epic proportions, potentially leading to an evening of awkward glances and haughty whispers. As the guests settled in, they would also be privy to the intricacies of the scone-cutting procedure. This was no mere act of slicing a pastry. It was a carefully choreographed dance, dictated by the unwritten rules of etiquette. The scone, once laid before the guest, had to be cut in a manner befitting their status. A lowly knight might slice his scone in half with the ease of a butter knife, while a lady of rank was expected to delicately break her scone into pieces as if it were made of crystal. The butter, of course, had to be spread with an equally delicate touch. A commoner might undertake the act of slathering butter with reckless abandon, while a noblewoman would merely dab a finger of butter onto her scone, as if each grain of butter carried the weight of her dignity. The stewards would watch these interactions with rapt attention, taking notes for the next inventory review, ensuring that no breach of etiquette might occur without consequence. And at the end of the evening, as the last scone was devoured and the remnants were swept away, the stewards would once again gather. They would convene to discuss the success of the feast, debating the merits of scone shapes, the adequacy of butter supply, and the effectiveness of their color-coded napkin system. So you see, dear viewer, the next time you engage in the simple act of enjoying a scone, remember this: you're not merely indulging in a treat. You're part of a long lineage of ridiculousness that stretches back through the ages. The medieval scone was more than just a pastry. It was a monument to the absurdity of social hierarchies, a repository of etiquette, and a testament to the lengths that people would go to ensure that not a single crumb was out of place. Nah. In the grand tapestry of history, the tale of scone-serving etiquette is woven with threads of monotony. Yet it stands as a reminder that even the most mundane details can shimmer with the shine of obscurity. So, raise your scone in toast to the medieval lords and ladies who navigated this culinary minefield, and the bureaucratic absurdity that kept their halls echoing with the echoes of both laughter and the clinking of goblets. Why, nay. Now, let's delve deeper into the vastly unexciting world of inventory procedures, material costs, and the bureaucratic rules that govern the very act of scone serving in the great halls of medieval times. Because, believe me, nothing says exciting historical content quite like the meticulous record-keeping of baked goods. Oh. Picture this. It's a gloomy Tuesday in 1247, and the local Lord Steward is scratching his head over a wax tablet filled with the cryptic shorthand of 13th century bureaucracy. The royal household is hosting a banquet, and the steward must ensure that the inventory of scones is not only sufficient, but also compliant with the ever-evolving standards of scone etiquette. Hence, he meticulously lists the required ingredients: flour, butter, milk, and a sprinkle of crushed dreams, while pondering the implications of a butter shortage. Yay! You see, in medieval England, butter was not just a condiment. It was a symbol of status, perhaps even more so than a shiny piece of armor. The price of butter fluctuated wildly based on the seasons, the whims of fairies, or whatever supernatural forces dictated the price of dairy, and the efficiency of the local butter churners. One could expect to pay anywhere from 2 pence for a small pat to an entire shilling for a lavish spread. The steward knew that if the butter supply dwindled, it could spell disaster for the entire scone operation. After all, a scone without butter is like a knight without armor, a sad, crumbly mess waiting for a battle that will never come. Denandi. As the steward juggled the inventory list, he faced another critical task: ensuring that the flour was ground to the correct fineness. A coarse flour would lead to scones that resembled half-baked rocks, while an overly fine flour would create an airy concoction that could be mistaken for a puff of smoke. The flour millers, those unsung heroes of the medieval kitchen, would be summoned to discuss the nuances of flour texture. Meetings would be scheduled, and minutes would be recorded. Minutes that would later be read aloud at the Scone-Serving Council, a gathering of determined individuals intent on defining the very essence of a scone. Let's not forget about the cost of these scone ingredients. The steward, armed with a quill, would meticulously tally expenses, calculating the cost of each ounce of flour, each knob of butter, and each splash of milk. This wasn't just drudgery. It was an intricate dance of numbers, akin to a medieval ballet. But with less grace and more spreadsheets, if only spreadsheets existed in the 13th century. The total cost of the scone production would be presented to the Lord, who, let's be honest, probably cared more about how many goblets of mead he could down that night than the actual economics of his pastry. Now, where was I? Yes, the bureaucratic rules surrounding scone serving. Believe it or not, the medieval Great Hall had a veritable cornucopia of regulations that came into play during scone service. First and foremost among these was the color-coding system for napkins. This was not some whimsical choice. It was a full-blown system of hierarchy. Napkins were assigned colors based on rank: white for the lord, blue for the knights, and a delightful shade of beige for the peasants. Should a lesser noble dare to use a white napkin, it could lead to a catastrophic social faux pas, resulting in whispered conversations behind closed doors and the potential for scandal worthy of a courtly drama. Jiwa. And let's not even begin to consider the seating arrangements. The Great Hall was a veritable chessboard of social stratification, with every scone-serving event requiring a precise seating chart. The Lord would sit at the high table, of course, while various knights and ladies would be arranged in a carefully orchestrated pattern of importance. Any peasant hoping to snag a scone would have to navigate the treacherous waters of social status, often resulting in a sconeless existence. Yes. But if the scone was served to the wrong person, it could lead to an upheaval rivaling the most tumultuous of feudal disputes. The noble class was particularly sensitive about their scone-serving rights, and should a scone be placed in the hand of a peasant before the lord had his fill, one could expect an uproar that would echo through the hall. You see, it wasn't just about the scone. It was about the entire framework of society. Each crumb carried the weight of tradition, and one misstep could send shockwaves throughout the feudal landscape. I say. Speaking of shockwaves, let's talk about the aftermath of a scone-serving event. The cleanup was another matter entirely. Once the mead-fueled revelry had subsided, the Great Hall would be left in a state resembling a battlefield. Crumbs strewn about like confetti, napkins tossed aside in a frenzy of conviviality, and remnants of scones withering away in the corners. The stewards would then face yet another bureaucratic challenge, the post-event inventory. Inventory after a scone serving was a science in itself. The head steward would scrutinize the remains, tallying not only the scones consumed, but also those that had been lost to the depths of the Great Hall's stone floor. Each uneaten scone would be accounted for, as it was imperative to understand the scone-to-guest ratio. Did too many scones remain? Or had the steward failed to predict the ravenous appetite of the lords and ladies? This crucial data would then be used to refine future scone-serving tactics. Perhaps a change in the recipe was in order. More sugar. A dash of cinnamon? Or perhaps, horror of horrors, an entirely new pastry would need to be introduced, leading to the potential for a pastry war of epic proportions. And let's not ignore the records kept by the Scone-Serving Council. Minutes were taken at every meeting, chronicling the decisions made about scone flavor, texture, and serving temperature. These documents would be guarded as precious treasures, passed down through generations of stewards, each adding their own annotations and doodles of the scone as they imagined it. A history of scone-serving etiquette so detailed that it would make even the most riveting of historical accounts seem like a light beach read. In the end, as you can see, the mundanity of medieval scone-serving etiquette was anything but mundane. It was a complex web of bureaucracy, inventory, and social maneuvering that would make even the most seasoned bureaucrat break into a cold sweat. So, the next time you find yourself biting into a perfectly fluffy scone, remember the hours of meticulous planning, the tears shed over misplaced napkins, and the unyielding quest for the ideal butter-to-scone ratio that brought that scone to your plate. Just think, each bite is a tribute to a world where every crumb mattered, where scone serving was not just an art, but a science governed by rules as tedious as they were essential. And as your taste buds rejoice in the buttery delight, let your mind wander back to those dreary halls filled with the echoes of scone-laden debates and bureaucratic absurdities that defined an era. Now, that's a flavor worth savoring. No, they know. Yes, the inventory procedures of medieval scone-serving etiquette, the unsung heroes of the Great Hall. Imagine, if you will, a bustling medieval kitchen where the air is thick with the aroma of baking bread and the din of clattering utensils. Now in the corner, there's a frazzled kitchen steward, desperately trying to keep track of every single scone that comes in and out, armed with nothing more than a quill, a scrap of parchment, and an unyielding commitment to absolute tedium. Yes, my friends, welcome to the riveting world of inventory tracking, where the only thing more exciting than counting scones is counting them again. First, let's explore the meticulous process of inventory management. Each day, the steward would gather all the scones, categorize them by size, flavor, and degree of fluffiness, which, believe it or not, was a significant factor in determining their market value. You might think a scone is just a scone, but in the medieval hierarchy, a fluffy scone was akin to gold. A dense scone? Well, that was akin to a social faux pas, akin to wearing socks with sandals at court. The stakes were high, and every scone's fate hung on a precarious balance of fluff and crumb. Now, the inventory ledger was not merely a list. It was a work of art. Each entry was inscribed in carefully crafted Gothic lettering, a style so ornate it could easily double as wall decoration. The steward would record the date, the number of scones baked, any that were removed for nobles' breakfasts, and, of course, any scones that had mysteriously vanished, likely due to the hands of a hungry page or a particularly stealthy rat. Every entry was accompanied by a footnote detailing the type of flour used, the brand of butter that was deemed acceptable by the court, and whether the eggs were sourced from the castle's own hens or acquired from the local market, a detail that could have profound implications for the scone's perceived quality. You see, butter in the medieval era was not just a condiment, it was a status symbol. The difference between local churned and imported French butter was akin to the difference between a Ford and a Ferrari in today's world. And when it came to budgeting for these culinary delights, the kitchen staff had to navigate the treacherous waters of material costs. Flour was relatively cheap, but butter? That was a different story. Depending on the season, the price of butter could fluctuate like a peasant's mood after a bad harvest. And if the kitchen overspent on butter, it meant fewer scones for the Lord's table, which could lead to catastrophic consequences, like an angry noble throwing a tantrum, or worse, throwing a scone. Speaking of catastrophes, let's dive into the bureaucratic rules that govern the scone-serving process. The Great Hall was not just a dining area. It was a stage for social performance, complete with a script of unwritten rules. There were protocols for everything from how many scones could be served to a single guest, which, for the record, was a strict limit of 3 per course, to how those scones should be presented. Each scone had to be placed at a precise angle on the plate, ideally at 45 degrees, an angle that was thought to maximize the scone's aesthetic appeal. Imagine the hours spent in training, teaching scullery maids and pages how to angle those scones just right, while avoiding the wrath of the head chef. And then there were the napkins. Ah yes, the illustrious napkins. Those seemingly innocuous pieces of cloth that held the power to make or break a scone serving. The napkin's fold was to be as grand as the scone itself, ideally shaped into a swan or some other majestic creature. Anything less would be deemed disrespectful to the scone. It was said that one nobleman had once been banned from the great feasts for an entire season after a particularly egregious napkin fold that resembled more of a crumpled potato sack than a swan. The lesson was clear. Treat your napkin with the reverence it deserves, or risk being exiled to the corners of mediocrity. Let's not forget the role of the server in this grand ballet of scone etiquette. Each server was trained not only in the delicate art of scone placement, but also in the art of conversation. It was essential to engage the diners in light banter about the weather, the latest court gossip, and of course, the scone's texture. "Isn't this scone simply divine?" was a phrase they had to master, delivered with just the right amount of enthusiasm. A server who didn't appreciate the fine nuances of scone texture could find themselves facing the wrath of the kitchen staff, and perhaps even a scone hurled in their general direction. And what about the serving utensils? They were not just tools, they were symbols of status and prestige. Silver tongs were the gold standard for scone serving, while wooden spoons were relegated to the common folk. The nobles would look down their noses at a server wielding anything less than silver, as if the very act of serving scones with a wooden spoon was a crime against humanity. The kitchen staff would polish those silver tongs to a shine that could blind a peasant on a particularly sunny day, all while maintaining a sense of dignity that was as fragile as the scones they served. Amende. Delices. Now, let's talk about the critical moment when the scones were actually served. Picture this. A great hall is packed to the brim with nobles, all eagerly awaiting their scone course. The grand moment arrives. Servers march in, tongues glinting, and as they approach the long, banquet-style tables, you could hear a pin drop, or, more accurately, you could hear the sound of many noble hearts beating in anticipation. As the servers began to place the scones down, there was an unspoken tension in the air, palpable enough to slice through with a butter knife. No. If a server stumbled, if a scone rolled off the plate, heaven forbid, they'd be met with gasps of horror as if a dragon had entered the hall, wreaking havoc. A single rogue scone could set off a chain reaction of chaos, leading to a complete breakdown of order, not unlike a medieval version of a corporate meltdown. There were even documented cases of entire feasts being derailed due to a single misplaced scone, leading to the kind of drama you would expect in a Shakespearean tragedy. To scone, or not to scone, became the battle cry of disgruntled guests who felt cheated by the chaos that ensued. And after the feasting was done, the aftermath of scone-serving etiquette was just as critical. The cleanup crew was tasked with the daunting responsibility of tallying the remaining scones. Yes, it was a race against time to count each leftover scone before the rats could get to them. A miscount could result in accusations of theft, or, worse, the loss of the kitchen staff's precious butter ration for the week. So, as we reflect on this labyrinthine world of medieval scone-serving etiquette, it's clear that every minute detail played a role in the grand tapestry of history. Each scone, each napkin fold, and each hasty quill stroke in the ledger contributed to a narrative that, while seemingly mundane, was essential to the societal fabric of the time. The echoes of those who served and consumed scones in the Great Hall still resonate, reminding us that even the most trivial of practices can have profound implications. So the next time you enjoy a scone, take a moment to appreciate the weight of its history, the bureaucracy, the social maneuvering, and the utter absurdity that shaped the very way we enjoy this delightful treat today. The scone, a humble baked good that has somehow managed to elevate itself from mere flour and water to a symbol of social stratification and elaborate bureaucracy in the medieval Great Hall. But hold on to your hats, dear viewers, as we embark on an excruciatingly detailed exploration of the inventory procedures, material costs, and the labyrinthine bureaucratic rules governing the scone-serving process. Grab your quills and parchment, because we are about to get unreasonably deep into the minutiae of medieval snack management. First off, let's talk inventory procedures. You might imagine a bustling kitchen filled with dedicated staff wielding butter knives and flour sacks. But in reality, the inventory was a meticulous, almost ritualistic process. Each day before the first scone was even baked, the head cook, an individual often more feared than revered, would convene the kitchen staff for what can only be described as a scone summit. This gathering typically began at the crack of dawn, with the staff huddled around a flickering candlelight, clutching their ledgers as if they were the Holy Grail itself. Now, the first order of business was to take stock of the existing culinary arsenal. The kitchen's inventory list would include not just scones, but also the various ingredients required to produce them. Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and of course the ever-elusive cream for clotted concoctions. But, alas, the inventory wasn't just a simple checklist. Oh no! Each item had to be meticulously counted, weighed, and entered into the ledger with a flourish that would make a modern accountant weep with jealousy. Imagine a cook with flour-dusted hands squinting at a barrel of flour, jotting down notes as if it were a top-secret military operation. 2 bags of flour, check. 1 sack of sugar. But where did that 5th egg go? The mere disappearance of an egg could lead to weeks of speculation and paranoia, with kitchen staff pointing fingers at the likely culprits, usually the rats, who were rumored to have their own underground egg-stealing syndicate. Once the inventory was complete, the head cook would then have to calculate the material costs. Ah yes, the finances. A topic that could make even the most riveting of medieval battles seem like a thrilling roller coaster ride. The cost of ingredients fluctuated wildly, often depending on factors such as local harvests, market demand, and the whims of the lord who controlled the purse strings. Flour prices could skyrocket if a neighboring lord decided to impose a grain tax, and suddenly your scone recipe becomes a delicate balancing act of economic strategy and culinary prowess. 9. To put this into perspective, let's say the price of butter rises due to a particularly harsh winter. Now, the head cook finds himself in a pickle. Do they sacrifice the quality of the scones by skimping on butter, or do they petition the Lord for a larger budget? The latter option often involved long, drawn-out meetings where the cook would have to wax poetic about the importance of scones in maintaining morale among the serfs. A happy stomach leads to a happy worker, he would exclaim, while secretly hoping that the Lord is simply hungry enough to approve the additional funds. After the inventory and budgetary gymnastics were complete, the scone-serving protocol came into play. This was where things truly got exciting. If you consider the arrangement of baked goods to be thrilling, that is. Once the scones were baked to a golden perfection, assuming they survived the oven without being scorched to oblivion, came the delicate task of presentation. Presentation was governed by a strict hierarchy of serving, dictated by the social standing of the individuals in attendance. In the great hall, the scones were laid out on long wooden tables, which, let's be honest, were probably more suited for a lumberyard than a dining hall. Each table would be adorned with freshly embroidered linen tablecloths, often painstakingly crafted by the ladies of the court, who were more than happy to flaunt their needlework skills. The scones would be arranged in careful rows, with the more prestigious flavors, currant and rosemary perhaps, positioned at the head of the table, while the less desirable varieties, like plain or oat, were relegated to the far end, where only the most desperate of guests dared to venture. But even the arrangement of scones was not without its complications. The head server, another figure of authority in the kitchen hierarchy, had to ensure that every guest was served according to their social standing. If a lowly squire dared to snag a scone meant for a nobleman, it would lead to a scandal of epic proportions, one that might even echo through the annals of history. Imagine the gossip that would circulate. Did you hear about Sir Reginald? He took a scone meant for Lady Beatrice. The nerve! A minor incident that could lead to feuds lasting generations. Now, let's not overlook the utensils involved in this endeavor. The medieval Great Hall was not equipped with the fine china and porcelain of modern-day tea parties. Instead, guests were presented with wooden platters and the occasional pewter mug, which may have seen better days. Scones were meant to be enjoyed with butter and jam, but the logistics of distributing such luxuries were fraught with complications. Butter was kept under lock and key, typically guarded by the head cook like a dragon hoarding treasure. Each serving of butter had to be carefully measured out with a wooden spoon, each spoonful marked in the ledger, of course, lest anyone attempt to pilfer a bit extra. As with all things in the medieval world, the consumption of scones was not merely a personal affair. No, it was a highly choreographed dance of social etiquette. Guests were expected to partake in a certain order, with the most esteemed individuals raising their hands for service, while the less fortunate waited anxiously, hoping for a chance to partake in the glory of a warm scone. The art of waiting was almost as important as the act of eating itself. Woe betide the guest who reached for a scone too hastily. They would be met with glares that could curdle cream. Once the scones were consumed, the inventory saga continued. The head cook would collect the remnants, those dreaded leftovers. The dreaded tallying process began anew. But before that, a critical step: the assessing of waste. Every scone not consumed would be meticulously logged, with explanations furiously scratched into the ledger. On half scone left on Lord Hufflepuff's plate, likely due to his gluten intolerance, noted for future reference. Yes, the sheer absurdity of this practice could only be rivaled by the meticulous scrutiny given to the final tally of rat incursions during the evening's feast. And let's not forget the bureaucratic rules governing all of this. There existed a rigid code of conduct, a set of unspoken rules that dictated how one should approach the scone-serving experience. For example, it was considered a grave offense to hover around the serving table, like some forlorn specter waiting for a crumb to fall. Instead, one was expected to stand back, hands clasped, and project an air of dignified patience, a skill that was honed over years of practice. The great hall would echo with the sounds of clinking mugs and the rustle of linen, as guests struggled to maintain decorum while eyeing the scone platter. The pressure was palpable, and the stakes were high. After all, nobody wanted to be the subject of a medieval scandal for all eternity. Remember the time Sir Percival was caught stealing a scone? How utterly disgraceful. So, in this vast web of scone-related bureaucracy, from the initial inventory to the final tally of leftovers, we see the layers of absurdity intertwining. It is a world where baked goods served as the linchpin of social interaction and power dynamics. Each scone represented so much more than a mere baked good. It was a reflection of societal norms, a testament to the relentless pursuit of culinary perfection, and a reminder that even in the most mundane of practices, there lies an intricate dance of human behavior, steeped in history's most trivial details. It's almost enough to make one forget that they're just talking about a glorified biscuit. Almost. Well, there you have it, folks. After an excruciatingly detailed journey through the labyrinthine norms of medieval scone-serving etiquette, we've uncovered the riveting truth about how our ancestors navigated the treacherous waters of baked goods in the Great Hall. Who knew that the way a scone was presented could spark a full-blown court scandal? From the delicate placement of the butter knife to the stringent rules governing the number of clotted cream dollops, we've explored it all. It's a culinary roller coaster that has left us all thirsting for, well, something a bit more exciting, to be honest. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, or perhaps just on the edge of a nap, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe for more thrilling tales of the utterly mundane, and drop a comment below about your own favorite flavor of scone, because why not? Oh, and for the true connoisseurs of boredom, make sure to turn on loop to experience this riveting saga all over again.